The New World intervened to save the Old World in 1918 and 1941, America and Europe. The relationship has been uneasy for much of the 20th century. So how will the relationship be shaped by the challenges of the 21st? So, is it time for Europe to mature as a power? And indeed, has it? Join me, Jan Darasz, for How We Got Here.
At a time of frequent geopolitical shifts and crises, the future of transatlantic unity between the European Union and the United States is being questioned more than ever. The shift in global trade dynamics, marked by the US importing more from Europe than from China in 2022, perhaps makes the problem seem less serious. Will this trend be able to become the new norm? Or will America invest less and less in transatlantic cooperation? Additionally, the surrounding geopolitical realities may soon change again, with the November 2024 US presidential election approaching. Until the outcome is known, the US remains somewhat reserved when it comes to leading the charge on tackling various European crises, such as Russia's aggression on Ukraine, knowing that a possible change of power could lead to the implementation of an entirely new foreign policy. This is seen as a chance of sorts by Germany and France to act as informal leaders and spokesmen of the European continent, especially given the United Kingdom's choice to leave the EU. The US is the EU's largest trade and investment partner, and European NATO members are reliant on US security guarantees, so any changes to the current US trade and defense policy would be highly consequential for Europe. The outlook for US security guarantees should former President Donald Trump retake the presidency is the issue causing the most consternation in Europe in the run-up to the election. One of Trump's most consistent views regarding American foreign affairs is criticism of insufficient defense spending in some NATO countries. Trump believes that all NATO member states should allocate more than 2% of their GDP on national defense, instead of hoping for American aid in the event of an armed conflict. The specter of a Donald Trump win makes some European lawmakers question the longevity of a transatlantic alliance. Apart from aid for Ukraine, the shape of which would most likely be radically changed, the future of global climate policy's efforts, international trade and political cooperation would also come under question.
Our guest today is Colonel Ray Wojcik. He's a retired colonel in the United States Army, a former military attaché at the US Embassy here in Warsaw. So welcome to the programme.
Great to be back.
Great to have you. First of all, before we start discussing about the wider and the deeper US-Europe relationship, just a bit of recent news. The statement by President Macron and Chancellor Scholz that they gave the green light for the Ukraine to hit Russian targets, providing they weren't civilian targets. How is this reflected in American policy, or how could it be reflected in American policy?
Well, I mean, for me personally, this is welcome news. This is something I've been saying, and many other people watching the war, observing, analyzing for some time, that we need to take the restrictions off of Ukraine. Not only do we need to give them the sophisticated long-range capabilities they need to not only eject the Russians from their territory, but the Russians have no limits on what they can do so far in Ukraine, hitting not only military sites, but civilian infrastructure, power infrastructure. So this is welcome news. From my perspective, the United States should have led this approach. But I understand the United States recently has begun serious discussions about either a policy to open up some elements of these capabilities to crossing the border. It's not clear how much the Ukrainians are actually right now already doing this with some capabilities, but we ought to give them the green light to at least hit the targets that the Russians are using, those bases where they're using artillery, long-range fires, air bases, targeting Ukrainians.
What was the philosophical underpinning that they couldn't do this? What made the United States stop at allowing them to hit targets? Was it the fact that this was possibly United States produced stuff that would be found in Russia later? What's the actual rationale for not doing this?
Well, it's the same pattern from the beginning of the war, this fear of escalation on several key policies, from weapons delivery, speed of transfer, and then more recently this funding gap, the United States debate over 6 months about funding.
Yes.
All those things are emblematic of a sort of a not clear policy or goal of what we're trying to do in Ukraine, and then making the main goal, sort of underpinning that, of being afraid of escalation. So the fear of escalation has driven more of the policy than we want Ukraine to win, and that needs to be turned around so that we can help Ukraine win.
So it's been a policy of not allowing Ukraine to lose, rather than giving them the wherewithal to win it.
Right.
How is this idea of mission creep in the United States thinking? Is that relevant, or is that going to happen anyway?
I wouldn't call this mission creep. I would call these pragmatic decisions that need to be made, that should have been made much earlier. So in my view, the training wheels or the restrictions telling the Ukrainians where they should target, advice on, of course, not hitting civilian targets and so on. We don't want Ukraine to become what they're fighting, and that's the last thing we would want. So telling the Ukrainians, we don't want you to hit hospitals, schools, or population centers, that's common sense. But to take out the targets that are hitting the Ukrainians in their own, especially right across the border in Belgorod, just north of Kharkiv, the Ukrainians are told they can't fire U.S. weapons across that border. So that's a problem. So I wouldn't call this a mission creep. We are at war. I think that's a problem the United States has. NATO and the United States, or United States with NATO, we're basically at war with Russia. We have to face that fact and start acting like it. We don't have a declared war, but our support of Ukraine is de facto like we're in a proxy war with Russia.
Yes. Are the statements by Chancellor Scholz and President Macron, do they represent a sea change in Europe? Is Europe maturing into a power, or is it more of the same? Lots of words and...
No, I hope there'll be some influence. I mean, over time, we've seen these different points of view coming out from either Berlin, Paris, or the United States on who is going to be the most cautious, it seems. And over time, we've heard some rhetoric, even out of Paris, that's actually much more aggressive about what the policies should be. The United States has been steady and strong in many fronts. There's no question that the United States has been a game changer as far as leading the overall unity of NATO and Europe with the United States to do something to help Ukraine. But it has not clearly articulated what the objective is, like you said, a difference between trying just to keep them from losing, or do we really want them to win, because we're not acting like it. And we're not acting like we're on a war footing, and I think we are.
Going back now into history, it's been a specific, or it's been a very fractious relationship since the end of the Second World War. Is this how you would categorize the relationship between Europe generally, if we can, or individual states, and the US policy? There's been a very anti-American strain, certainly among the intellectual left, for example. Mm-hmm. Is this damaging, or is this something that the United States and Europe just have to put up with?
I think it's the latter. And, the experience of the Cold War, where we had a common objective, especially as the Transatlantic Alliance, to defeat Russia during the Cold War, was a unifying key factor. Now we have that sort of reborn. So some of those aspects of the Cold War, unity, cohesion, common enemy, defense industrial, rebooting defense industrial cooperation. A lot of these things are coming back to the fore. There's been over the last, especially the last 5-6 years, a debate about how much should the U.S. be involved. Actually, that's gone on since the end of the Cold War. Yes. Is NATO? No, of course we have brain dead. Recently in Paris, but we have that debate in the 90s and so on. Should we enlarge? Should we not enlarge? What are we doing? Are we inviting Russian aggression? We're not inviting Russian aggression because we're going to liberate or help free these states permanently if we enlarge NATO, extend the EU to them. So that's where we went, and that was the right place to go. The one key aspect I would just add to this point about these back and forth with the U.S.-European debate, 2 points. One, the economic relationship is the largest on the planet. Stability of Europe, stability in Ukraine is very, very vital to American economic interests. So there's a number one reason why we need to stay involved and help Europe be stable. Number two, we need to help defeat Russia now, and that will push back all this aggression for at least a generation. Russia is already set back significantly, but Russia is learning, and Russia is retooling its industry and getting stronger. And then the last is the debate about China. Are we going to allow China to watch us fail in helping Ukraine to victory? And if they see that, then we're going to have even more problems around the globe, specifically in the Pacific.
There are reports, or there are papers that have been written about the demographic shift in United States thinking and also in European thinking. The European younger generation in Europe is less pro-American than, say, my generation was, for example. Same thing in the United States, is shifting off to the Pacific. This is an issue that's been alive, active in most of the 20th century. Churchill's great triumph was to bring Europe, to be Europe first, to bring America into Europe and treat the Pacific as a secondary, if I can describe it as a secondary theatre. Is that changing, or do we still have a consensus on that Europe is the centre for this policy?
I think one thing, maybe one, symbol of Americans' remaining commitment to Europe. Look at the vote in Congress. I know there were 6 months of debate about the support to Ukraine, but basically, when you put the houses together, the Senate and that lower house, 75%, 3/4 of the Congress voted to support Ukraine. That's a vote for Europe, in my view. The stability of Europe, the protection of Europe, the national interest of Europe. So that's all there, I believe, still embedded both in the government and latently in the population. Where we need to work on this issue is the leadership narrative, both in education systems and at the top. And what we haven't had, in my view, enough of, is the narrative from the White House and the leadership of our government to the American people on a constant basis, why Ukraine is important, what's at stake, and why we need to help Ukraine defeat Russia. So Ukraine's victory, and saying those words. Setting that objective sets everything else under it. The Pacific is the biggest threat the U.S. has on the globe. The Chinese threat, the threat from China is. There's no denying it. That's why Europe and the United States have to do more to strengthen forward defense here, help Europe up its game. Europe is still, many countries, I think 2/3, still haven't reached 2%. I understand at the NATO summit in July, many more will commit to it. So that's all good, and we're going the right direction. In my view, it's not fast enough. It needs to be faster. And we need to see the strategy that's going to help Ukraine get to victory. U.S. committed to deliver a strategy on what our role is going to be by 8th of June, which is 45 days after that last bill was passed. So that strategy is our chance to finally set the path straight of how we're going to help Ukraine to victory. And then again, that impacts what happens in the Pacific. So we haven't left Europe.
I mean, we're going to have the D-Day celebrations. Is the narrative about the Second World War one that is oversimplified about the fact that America, true enough, went in, bailed us out, as in Europe, but the alliances that the Western allies had to make were equally as cynical as our enemies.
I think,
in the sense that we had to ally ourselves with Joseph Stalin and to defeat Hitler, then accept the division of Europe, all that sort of stuff. Is that current in America, or are the narratives, the myths, still strong? Not just in America, but they're strong in Britain, strong in France, etc., etc.
Mm-hmm. The closer we get to the last of what we call the greatest generation, the World War II veterans in America passing on, the good news is at least one more generation, the children and the grandchildren of those veterans are still very active. I was just in Anzio, Italy, Monte Cassino, where the Poles led a victory there in 1944 of the whole of all the Western allies. And it was significant to see the amount of support from the descendants and the understanding of what that battle meant still in play with those family members. That's the seed, I think, for getting out this understanding of how important allies are, the Western Alliance, and the understanding of that we're committed to each other, because the alternative, what happened at the end of World War II, is almost going to get repeated unless we learn the lesson of stopping Russia now in Ukraine.
Yes, and I suppose it just goes to show that alliances, however they are very fragile organizations, aren't they? They need to be there are always works in progress, I suppose.
What did Churchill say? The only thing worse than fighting with allies is fighting without allies.
Yes. Ray Wojcik, thank you very much for coming onto the program. That's all we have time for.
Great to be around. Thank you.
That's all we have time for. Join us, please, next time for How We Got Here.